the most interesting thing that I've learned about sex differences in the last year is differences in throwing accuracy amongst children. Can you please red pill everybody that's listening on the differences in throwing accuracy amongst children?
Sure. So, yeah. So you find differences in throwing accuracy, throwing distance, and velocity. So even in preschoolers, boys are throwing more. They can throw farther and with higher velocity, higher speed, and so higher kinetic energy than girls can. It emerges very early, as I said, the preschool years, and becomes extremely large by 19, early adulthood or so, where there's very little overlap between men and women, maybe a little bit, but not much. It is a very big difference. It is correlated with differences. The shoulders are built differently. The forearms are longer in men relative to overall size in women. That difference is evident prenatally. It is associated with the sex difference in this dorsal stream sort of thing, the ability to track moving objects. To hit something, you have to have the cognitive system, in brain and cognitive system in place in order to hit something accurately. And if somebody's throwing something at you, you want to be able to track it coming in so you can dodge it.
Oh yeah, didn't you looked at a study to do with how effective males and females are at dodging projectiles coming at them? Can you tell us that study?
Yeah. So some people have argued that, or in fact, the initial argument, and maybe it's still the argument, that the male advantage in throwing distance, accuracy, speed, and all of that sort of thing is due to shared childcare and male hunting. And of course, there is a big sex difference in hunting engagement in traditional context. No question about that. But in addition to that, men are better at dodging things. So in this particular study, you couldn't do it anymore, but the researchers, if I remember correctly, got one of these tennis ball shooting machines and decided to shoot them at undergraduates to see what would happen.
I'm sure the professors had a fantastic time when they were aiming it at the annoying child in the front row that keeps on distracting them during their lectures.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't do that anymore. But I'm sure it was at fairly low speed, and so nobody would get hurt, and so relatively easy task. And so they just looked at the number of balls that could be blocked, and men blocked most of them. In fact, there was a ceiling effect, and women were not as successful at that. And that's obviously a defensive mechanism. If other males are using projectile weapons, the ability to track and dodge that is an important component of male-male competition. That's been my arguments, which came probably before hunting.
What is the suite of traits that we're talking about here when it comes to throwing accuracy, throwing velocity, dodging, seeing things moving through the air, etc.?
Yeah. So we have the throwing component to it. It has, the behavioral component, actually throwing something and hitting it accurately. It has physical components to it. The upper body strength is big sex difference there. The architecture of the shoulder and arms. There's brain area associated with motion detection, and integrating motion detection with physical movements, as in blocking something or throwing something. And so there's brain and cognitive systems involved there. That you see physical systems, the behavioral component, the brain and cognitive component, and guys are better on all of those components, or at least most of them. Integrated together, you get quite a large sex difference.
So learning that, and it was specifically the accuracy thing that really drove it home to me, is for me now one of the more compelling justifications for us thinking about transgender athletes in sport a lot more carefully, because everybody has heard to death someone talking about how a biological male shouldn't be able to step into the ring with a biological female after a year of estrogen and testosterone suppression and then punch their face into the ground. Like, it's self-evident. And a lot of the arguments that I've seen stem exclusively from, well, we can reduce power by X amount by putting them on this particular type of hormone blocker. Testosterone and androgens aren't all that drive power. Then someone comes back and says, well, look at bone density, look at muscle mass, look at all of the time that you've gone through puberty, blah, blah, blah. That's done. Like, it's interesting. I guess it was interesting, but it's no longer interesting to me. What is much more interesting to me are the fundamental capability differences, especially when it comes to things like accuracy. Because if, let's say, for instance, that you were to have a biological male that is going into the the baseball NBA? No, what's the baseball league called?
Is there a women's league?
Yeah, well, there must be. I've got to imagine so. But the same as the WNBA, right? Okay, so let's say that a male goes into the WNBA. They're not taller. They're not bigger. They're built the same on average as the average female basketball player. Because I would imagine that female basketball players probably pretty tall, taller than me, taller than you. But what we're saying is that there is a fundamental capability difference that biological males have with just the way that they see throwing and spatial rotation generally. Not just to do with the physicality of the architecture of the shoulder, changes in forearm length, etc., but the way that their brains are able to see the world of throwing overall. This also explains to a degree why the WNBA may be significantly less popular than the men's division, not because women are smaller and something else, but they have a predisposition that is, you could say that males' capacity is overclocked. And it is supercharged comparatively with women. So this to me is one of the most compelling reasons, because it gets beyond this sort of messy conversation about power, and it gets more into fairness. And it's why it's so compelling. And I've never really heard anyone do a full treatise on this area of transgender athletes in sport. What is it? Let's say that there was a sport where you had to do lying detection, or you had to manipulate different social groups, or you had to be able to detect facial cues or something. If you were to have female to male transitioners in that sport, they're going to absolutely dominate the league, even if they have taken testosterone for ages and they're walking around with their sociosexuality through the roof and their sex drive's really high or whatever. I just found it's really fascinating. I think this is really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah. Some of the spatial differences and the perceptual differences that I mentioned are more strongly related to prenatal or an early postnatal hormonal exposure than actual circulating testosterone. So the men's circulating testosterone isn't really highly correlated with their spatial abilities, but the earlier exposure seems to be what's important there. So yeah, you can decrease muscle mass a little bit by reducing testosterone, but there's other things you're not going to change that people haven't, as you said, talked about.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.